It is necessary to remark that such an impulse inherent in the presence of all free-brain beings of our great universe formerly arose and became actualized almost normally in the majority of terrestrial beings of that time, namely from the time of the removal of the organ Kundabuffer from the common presences of the free-brain beings of the planet Earth right up to the second Transnauparnian perturbation. But later, among the number of chief evils which flow from the conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves, especially when in the presences of every terrestrial free-brain being, there began to become predominant the evil inner god of theirs I mentioned, named there self-calming. Then it occurred that in them, under the influence of the action of Zolionensius, instead of the desire and striving for a speedier self-perfection, a something began to arise such as they themselves characterized by the words need of freedom, which chiefly serves the cause of the arising there of these same grievous processes of theirs, similar to this last Bolshevism. I will explain to you somewhat later how they represent to themselves this famous freedom of theirs, and now I will only tell you that feeling which arises from the action of Zolionensius strengthens in them the need for some or other general change in the conditions of their ordinary external being existence, which until then were more or less stable. After the second Transparnian perturbation to this ill-starred planet of yours, that is, after the loss of Atlantis, the action of the cosmic law Zolionensius in the general presences of these favourites of yours was actualized at least 40 times, and almost from the very beginning, each time, thanks already to this strange need of freedom, which has since been fixed in the majority of them, almost the same proceeded as in recent years, still proceeds on that part of the surface on your planet on which the totality of the existing groups is called Russia. Here it is extremely important also to notice that the existence itself of these terrifying processes could not in any way take place there among the free-brain beings of the planet Earth, if those data which had remained intact in their subconsciousness for the engendering of the being impulse conscience, to which data the most saintly Ashiata Shamash was the first to turn his attention, and upon which he relied for the fulfilment of his mission, had taken part in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs, which has become habitual for them during their waking state. Only in consequence of the fact that the data for the sacred impulse of being conscious do not take part in the function of this consciousness of theirs, the actions of the law Zolionensius, just as well as of other inevitable cosmic laws, are moulded into such abnormal and for themselves pitiable forms. Although the whole totality of causes serves as the sources for the arising of the second factor, yet in my opinion the basic cause also in the given case is nevertheless this fact, that their famous subdivision into castes becomes established among them regarding their mutual relationship among themselves, which subdivision has constantly existed there with the exception only of that period when there was definitely rooted among them the results of the most saintly labours of Ashiata Shamash. The difference is only in this, that in former centuries the division into different castes proceeded from the consciousness and intention of several separate individuals there, while now this proceeds quite automatically without the participation of anyone's will or anyone's consciousness. Now, my boy, I find it opportune to explain to you a little about this, namely in what way and in what gradations these favourites of yours became automatically sorted out from their different celebrated castes, and how they later already began to subdivide themselves into these castes. When, according to various chance circumstances, and wherever significant groups of them became concentrated and they exist together, then several of them, in whom firstly for some reason or other the consequences of the property of the organ Kundabuffer had been previously well crystallized, the totality of which crystallizations in general gives to their common presences the impulses for what is called cunning, and secondly, in whose hands at the given time there appear for some reason or other many different what are called terrifying means, or what they themselves call weapons, quickly set themselves apart from other beings, and putting themselves at their head, constitute the beginnings of what are called the ruling class. And further, since in all the free-brained beings of the planet Earth, and particularly of recent times, the sacred being impulse called conscience does not take part in the functioning of their general consciousness, in consequence of which in them there is absent even the very need for making any conscious being effort at all, then they, that is, the beings who had set themselves apart, and who had signed themselves to the ruling class, profiting by the said terrifying means, compel other beings of the given groupings to produce for them even those efforts which every being should inevitably actualize in ordinary being existence. And other beings of these groupings, also not wishing for the same reasons personally to produce these being efforts, no, not even for others, and at the same time being afraid of the mentioned terrifying means of the beings of the ruling class, begin to have recourse to all kinds of cunning in order, as is said there, to load on one another's back such being efforts as are inevitably required for the beings of the ruling class. And as a result, the beings of every such grouping usually sort themselves out gradually and fall into diverse categories according to the degree of skill of their artfulness. And so, from the division of the beings into categories of this kind, there just begins in the following generations a subdivision and an assigning of each other into these famous castes of theirs. From this assigning of each other into castes of diverse kinds, there is already by itself infallibly crystallized in the common presence of each of them in relation to the beings who belong to all other castes, that being data which is called hate, just that data which was never in any other beings in the whole of our great universe, and which in its turn engenders in the common presence of everyone those impulses shameful for the free-brained beings, which they themselves call envy, jealousy, adultery, and many other similar impulses. And so, my boy, these terrifying processes of reciprocal destruction and of the destruction of everything already attained by them there proceed partly from this, that in those periods when in their common presences the action of the cosmic law solionensius becomes evident, besides the already mentioned need for freedom in them on the one hand, the intensity of the action of the data for engendering constantly the impulse of timidity before power possessors automatically diminishes, which data has already become inherent in their common presences, and on the other hand the intensity of the action of that said strange being data increases, which data provokes hate in the given case in relation to the beings who belong to other castes. That is why I said that this subdivision of theirs into castes which bring about the totality of the results of these unique strange being data, which always increase in their functionings and which flow, as you may have already from all that I have told you, doubtless been convinced, also from the conditions of their abnormal, ordinary being existence, just serves chiefly as the second factor for the arising of these terrifying processes. These terrible processes usually arise and flow in the following sequence. It always begins with this, that several beings from one or another grouping, namely those in whom for some reason or other there were previously crystallized data stronger than in other beings, which data engendered the mentioned strange impulses in relation to the beings who belong to other castes, particularly to the beings who belong to the caste of the ruling class, seeing and feeling reality more than others under the influence of the action of solionensius. They begin, as is said there, to clamour, and these clamouring orators, become in relation to those around them, such as are at the present time there usually called leaders. And further, thanks on the one hand to this clamour, and on the other hand, thanks to the action of always the same cosmic law soli onensius, which action is always combined abnormally in the presences of all of them, others also begin to clamour. When these clamourers among the ordinary beings begin already excessively cacophonically to act upon what are called the effeminate nervous of the left half of several of the power-possessing beings of the given community, and these latter order those whose job it is to grease what is called Scottish cream the navels of several particularly loud-voiced clamourers, then there begin these excesses of theirs which, progressively increasing, reach their zenith, yet to their misfortune ultimately always lead to nothing. These processes of theirs, if they had even but a little improved the existence of beings of subsequent generations, then perhaps from the point of view of a strictly impartial observer, they might even not have appeared to be so terrifying. Yet to the misfortune of all free-brain beings of our great universe, the calamity is just in this, that as soon as the blissful action of this cosmic lawful manifestation ceases, and these terrifying processes come to an end, then there again begins the old story, and their ordinary being existence becomes more bitter than before, and parallel with this there also deteriorates what is called their sane awareness of the sense and aim of their existence. This latter deteriorates, in my opinion, chiefly because, after these processes, the leading beings of the former ruling class are usually replaced by beings who proceed from other different castes, and who, before this last process, did not have in the persons of their representatives, either of the present or past generations, anything in common, even consciously or unconsciously, with that being manifestation in which is included the ability to lead the outer, and now and then even the inner process of the being existence of surrounding beings, who, although it's similar to them, yet in the sense of reason had not yet attained to their degree. Justice demands it to be admitted that although in the common presences of the free-brain beings there of the old ruling class, the data present in their subconsciousness for the engendering of real being conscious also did not take part in the function of their what is called waking consciousness, yet, at least, they usually had the habit of ruling, acquired by heredity, and improving automatically from generation to generation. In the presences of the beings who had newly attained to power, not only is real being conscience absent, as was also absent in the beings of the former ruling class, but further, in them, in addition, those charms begin particularly stormily to manifest and give extraordinary and terrifying results, which charms are crystallized in general in the presences of terrestrial free-brain beings, especially of recent times in consequence of the properties of the organ kundabuffer, such as vanity, pride, self-conceit, self-love, and others which, as they had as yet hardly ever been satisfied to a sufficient degree, are in them in their functionings particularly new. To these terrestrial beings who become impromptu power-possessing, and who have not any hereditary data at all in themselves, even for the automatic ability to rule, one of the sayings of our dear teacher could well be applied, which he expresses in the following words: I never yet met that idiot who, accustomed to shuffle in a pair of old shoes, would feel comfortable in smart new ones. And really, my boy, when, each time on the planet Earth, the action of soli onensius ceases, and their relatively normal existence, already somehow established, again begins among your favourites, then the newly baked power-possessing beings usually cut those capers thanks to which the birth rate of what are called slugs, snails, lice, mole crickets, and many other similar parasites who destroy everything good, each time always increases more and more on that planet. As I have begun to speak about Bolshevism, then I will relate to you here on this subject, in order yet once again to give you an example of one peculiarity of the being existence of your favourites, which had already become fully proper to them, about one of their naive arguments which is not without its humour. This naivety of theirs, which may arise through an already excessively wretched logical confrontative being rumination, consists in this, that although all events there, without exception, in the sense of mutual relationships among themselves, proceeded during the last 2 centuries exclusively already by themselves without any participation of the consciousness or intention of whomever it may be of the contemporary beings, they nevertheless always ascribe with certainty, and even with jealousy, all the results, good as well as bad, flowing from these events, to one or another among them similar to themselves. And such an abnormality, which had become fixed in the totality of their spiritualized parts, resulted from the following causes. First of all, from their common presences, there gradually totally disappeared all those being data, the totality of which in general is capable of engendering in the presences of beings a property called presentiment of the future, in consequence of which they are entirely deprived of the possibility in any degree whatever of foreseeing imminent events. Secondly, having a narrow what is called horizon and a short memory, they not only know nothing about long past events on their planet, but even do not remember about that which proceeded quite recently, almost even yesterday. And thirdly, these cosmic laws are unknown to them, thanks to which there chiefly arise those sorrowful events which proceed among them. Owing to all this, these same contemporary favourites of yours are sure in all their presences that this terrifying process, which they call Bolshevism, proceeded for the first time on their planet, and that nothing like this already darling civilization of theirs had ever existed previous to them, and they are even sure that this has happened thanks only to the evolution of the gradually progressing reason of the beings similar to themselves of their planet. Their confrontative argument on the subject of similar processes, which had taken place many times in the past on their planet, may serve as a very good example for the illustration and characterization of the phenomenal dullness and bluntness of that being rumination which they have. According to the common sense of every free-brain being, similar processes had to proceed, and since I became interested in the strange psyche of these favourites of yours, and occupied myself with every aspect of the observation of them, I myself have been a witness, as I have said, no less than 40 times, of exactly similar processes, which I would call the process of the destruction of everything within sight. It is interesting to notice that almost half of all these terrifying processes proceeded not very far from that place where their, as they themselves call it, cultured existence is now concentrated. They proceeded on that part of the surface of their planet which they name Egypt. These terrifying processes proceeded on this same Egypt so often, in consequence of the fact that this part of the surface of your planet, during the course of long periods of time, found itself in relation to the common cosmic harmonious movement in the position of what is called the centre of gravity radiations, and that is why the influence of the cosmic law so Leonensius often acted on the presence of the free-brain beings breeding there, and often brought forth in them such an abnormality. A parallel comparison of the real data concerning the events which took place on the same Egypt, and those data about them which became fixed in the being representation and understanding of almost every responsible being of famous contemporary culture, and which are known to them, as it were, thanks to their already perfected reason, might serve as an obvious illustrative example of from what general data their logical mentation, at the period of their responsible existence, is built up and consists, and likewise gives me the possibility yet once again to notice and emphasize to you all the maleficence in an objective sense of their usage, which was finally fixed in the process of their ordinary existence, and which they themselves call by the high-sounding words education and schooling of the growing generation. The point is that among the number of all possible kinds of ephemeral fantastic informations, from the totality of which, as a result, their strange reason proper to them alone is formed there is likewise the history of this same Egypt. This fantastic history, evidently thought out by some or other candidate for Hasnasmas individuals among them, was even made for them what is called an obligatory subject in all educational establishments, in which this history, among other similar stupidities, is strongly hammered into their separate concentrations for the functioning of spiritual perceptions and manifestations, that is, into what they themselves would call the brains of these unfortunate future responsible beings. And further, when they become such, these fantastic informations learned by them parrot-like by compulsion serve them as material for being associations and for logical confrontative mentation. That is why, my boy, at the present time there on that ill-fated planet, every being who has already reached responsible age, instead of the real knowledge which every normal free-brain being should have concerning the events which took place on their planet in the past, knows about everything in the same way in which, as in the present case, he ruminates with his being reason and unconsciously becomes aware with all his being about this same Egypt. There's no gainsaying in it. Each one of the already, according to them, responsible free-brain beings of this strange planet already knows, thanks to their system of education and schooling, the history of the beings who existed in the past on this Egypt. Yet how, thanks to the said means of perception of informations which they themselves call learning parrot-like, he knows this, and what totality of the being representation about this results from all three of his spiritualized being parts, you may picture to yourself with your own eyes, and clearly understand from the following illustration of mine. Almost every one of them knows that among ancient Egyptians there were 24 dynasties. But if any one of them is asked, why are there so many dynasties among them, it would then appear that he had never even thought about it. Further, if one continues to insist on an answer, then this same being who up till now knew and was sure with all his being that there were 24 dynasties among the ancient Egyptians, he at best, of course on the condition if one helps him to be able to be sincere and to express aloud associations flowing in his mentation, reveals his logical mentation in some such way. Among the Egyptians there were 24 dynasties. Well, this proves that among the Egyptians there existed a monarchical state organization, and that the position of the king passed by inheritance from father to son, and as it was customary that the kings of one generation should have the same family name, and that all the kings who had this name composed one dynasty, then therefore they had as many different dynasties of kings as there were family names. Very understandable, and as clear as the patch on the baggy trousers of the Honourable Mullah Nasir ad-Din. And if any of the beings of contemporary culture infallibly desires and will continue to pant in order to explain well to his reason why among these ancient Egyptians the family name of their kings changed so often, then again, at very best, his being mentation will associate approximately in the following sequence. He will say, evidently in olden times in this Egypt it often happened that the kings, or as they are named there, pharaohs, grew tired of reigning and abdicated their power, and this abdication in all probability proceeded in the following way and approximately under the following circumstances. Let us suppose that some pharaoh or other named John Geoffrey lived peacefully and with full satisfaction and ruled over all the Egyptians. Well, once this same king or Pharaoh John Geoffrey felt a very great weariness from this reigning of his, and one sleepless night, having pondered over his kingly position, first of all constated and realised with all his being that, wish it or not, one grows tired of reigning, and that this occupation in general is an extremely trying job, and could not be said to be, for his personal felicity, either useful or safe. The Pharaoh John Geoffrey became impressed with this realisation, and, profiting by the experience of his existence in the past, decided to try and find out how to prevail upon somebody or other, so that this other might deliver him from the said, for him, undesirable weariness. To this end he probably invited some or other still ordinary John Geoffrey to come to him, and in a very polite way spoke to him roughly as follows: "My highly honourable and incomparably kind John Geoffrey, I frankly confess to you, as to my only friend and subject worthy of my trust, that this kingdom over which I rule has already grown too wearisome for me, and this has happened perhaps because I am already extremely tired. As regards my dear son and heir, to whom I might now hand over the kingdom, he, speaking between ourselves, is, in spite of his very strong and healthy appearance, in fact, neither one nor the other. You, as a father known for his love for his posterity, will surely understand if I tell you that I very much love my son and heir, and that I would not like him to reign and get tired as I have. Wherefore, I have just decided to propose to you, as a faithful subject and personal friend, to deliver me and my son from reigning, and to take this high obligation upon yourself." And since evidently this still ordinary John Geoffrey was firstly, as is said there, a good sport, and secondly being a rascal who had much vanity, he, with tears in his eyes, shrugged his shoulders. "If I must be lost, then let me be lost," consented, and from the very next day began to reign. As the family name of this second John Geoffrey was different, therefore on the very next day the number of Egyptian dynasties was increased by yet one more. And so, as many pharaohs of this Egypt often grew tired, and, loving their sons, did not desire the same for them, they renounced their kingdoms in this way to others, and hence so many dynasties piled up there. In reality, however, the change of dynasty in this Egypt did not proceed so simply, and in the intervals between two dynasties there proceeded such perturbations in comparison with which this contemporary Bolshevism is merely child's play. In the heat of this contemporary Bolshevism, I happened several times to be an eyewitness of the sincere indignation of several of those who, for some reasons, of course personally independent of them, did not happen to take part in this same process, and who could therefore half-consciously observe from the outside, and with all their presences grow sincerely indignant at the actions of the individual beings similar to themselves who were active persons in this terrifying process, namely, at the action of those individuals similar to them, whom on this occasion they called, and still up to now called, Bolsheviks. In my opinion, it will do no harm here, a preface, to tell you that being experience of theirs, which is excellently characterised by the words, vainly to grow sincerely indignant, also appears to be one of the unfortunate particularities of the psyche of these ill-fated, free-brained beings who please you, especially of the contemporary ones. Thanks only to this psychic abnormality, they gradually become more deranged in their common presences, many functionings, both of their planetary body, already deranged without this, and of their body Kajjan, if of course this second being body is already coated in them, and has attained to the required, what is called, individuality. And such an abnormality of their psyche, namely, vainly to grow indignant, or, as they themselves say, vainly to grow agitated, also flows from this, that from their common presences there has already long since disappeared the being horizon proper to be present in the free-brained beings, as well as the instinctive sensing of reality in its real light. On account of the absence in their psyche of these two particularities, they could not even approximately suspect that individuals similar to themselves were in no way the cause of these terrifying processes there, and that these processes of their ill-fated planet proceed from two inevitable great causes. The first of these causes is just the cosmic law, solio nensius, entirely independent of them. And the second cause, partly dependent on them, consists in this, that, thanks to the totality of all the results of the abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence established by themselves, which still continue to be crystallized in their common presences, the data for bringing forth the sacred impulse conscience do not in general take part in any of them in the functioning of their ordinary waking state, in consequence of which the action of the first cause takes just this terrible form. They, as I've already said, could not even approximately consider and understand that, during these common planetary terrifying processes, individual persons are in no way the cause, and only by chance happen to be in those posts, the occupations of which, on account of the conditions of mutual existence which had already been established, compels them to manifest themselves in one or other role, the results of which roles, according to law conformity, entirely independent of them themselves, are cast into these or other forms. In the heat of this last process of theirs, namely during this Russian Bolshevism, the contemporary beings of other communities grew very sincerely agitated when the beings who by chance had become, as it were, active in this distressing process, gave orders to other ordinary beings, as it is said, to shoot any Tom, Dick or Harry. For the clarity of my further explanation concerning these terrifying processes of your unfortunate favourites, you must be further told about this, that this last process proceeded, and until today continues to proceed, on a large area of the surface of this ill-fated planet, and that during recent times these favourites of yours have very greatly increased in quantity. If therefore we compare the quantity of the contemporary free-brain beings who have been destroyed during this last process with those destroyed in the previous process, then this last process will indeed seem child's play. In order that you may better understand this and compare those former processes with this contemporary Bolshevism, I will now give you a couple of little scenes from former history, from, let us say, the Egypt I've already mentioned, when, in one of the intervals between the dynasties of these Egyptian pharaohs or kings, there proceeded in Egypt a process such as this contemporary Bolshevism. The chief committee of the revolutionaries announced to all the population of that country, among other things, that elections would soon begin for the chiefs of the large and small points of theirs, or as they say, towns and villages, and that these elections would proceed on the following principles. Those were to be elected as chiefs for the towns and villages who had put in their sacred vessels more of what are called kronans than others. A kronan was the name given there in Egypt to sacrificial offerings. The point is that according to what is called the religion of the beings of this country, it was the custom among others during religious ceremonies, which proceeded in special places, to put before each ordinary being who went to these ceremonies special clay vessels, so that each ordinary being there had to put into these sacred vessels each time, after the utterances of certain prayers, vegetables or fruit specially designated for the given day. Well, these worthy things for offering as sacrifices were then called krons. In all probability, this manipulation was devised by the theocrats of that time as a profitable item for the welfare of their, as they are called, sycophants. In that degree about which I have just told you, it was stated that on that occasion krons had to consist of the eyes of outcasts, by which word the ordinary free-brain beings there called those beings behind their backs, who belonged to the caste of the ruling class, by which name then all the beings of this caste, wholesale, were called without excluding the beings of the passive half, children, or old folk. Further, in this announcement it was stated that he who would have on the day of the elections the most crowns in his sacred vessel would be appointed as chief of the whole of Egypt, and in the remaining towns and villages those would be appointed as chiefs who in their sacred vessels had the correspondingly greatest number of crowns. You may picture to yourself, my boy, what on that day began to be accomplished everywhere in that Egypt, in order to have in their sacred vessels the greatest number of eyes of the beings who belonged in that period of the flow of time to the caste of the ruling class. On another occasion, also there in Egypt, I became a witness of a not less terrifying scene. For a clear representation about this also terrifying scene, it is first of all necessary to tell you that there, that is, in this Egypt, there was formerly in every one of their large points or towns a large square on which proceeded all kinds of public, as they are called, religious and military ceremonies, where during these ceremonies were gathered masses of the beings from the whole of Egypt. These beings, especially the masses of beings who belonged at the given moment to the weak castes, impeded the ceremonies, and therefore a certain pharaoh ordered ropes to be stretched around these squares, so that the beings who belonged to the simple castes should not disturb the progress of the ceremony. But when the said ropes were stretched, it soon became evident that they would not withstand the pressure of the crowd, and might often break. Then the pharaoh ordered what are called metal ropes to be made, whereupon those who are called priests there consecrated them and gave them the name of sacred cables. These sacred cables around the squares for the public ceremonies, particularly in the large towns of Egypt, had at that time a colossal length, sometimes reaching to 1 centrotino, or as the contemporary beings of your planet would say, 10 miles long. Well, I was a witness of how a crowd of ordinary Egyptian beings began to string onto one of those sacred cables, just like an Asiatic shashlik, the beings, without distinction of sex or age, who up till then had belonged to the ruling class. And the very same night, with the help of 40 pairs of buffalo, this original skewer was dragged and thrown into the river Nile. I saw such punishment meted out in this spirit, both during my stay personally on the surface of this planet of yours, as well as through the large Tescuanu from the planet Mars. And these contemporary favourites of yours, naive already to the nth degree, grew sincerely indignant that these contemporary Bolsheviks of theirs shot a certain Tom Brown. If we compare the actions of the former free-brain beings there, who were subject to this psychic state, with the actions of these contemporary Bolsheviks, then they, i.e. the contemporary Bolsheviks, ought even to be given praise and thanks that in spite of the fact that the various consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer are infallibly completely crystallized in their common presences, as in general in the presences of contemporary free-brain beings, they, in the very heat of that period when they were entirely puppets under the influence of the inevitable cosmic law Solioensius, manifested themselves with these consequences in such a way that the dead body of the person shot by them could at least be recognised as whose it was, namely, Tom Brown's and nobody else's. In this place of his towel, Beelzebub deeply sighed, and gazing at one spot, became concentratedly thoughtful. Hussein and Nahum, with a shade of surprise, but also with some sadness on their faces, began to stare expectantly at him with, as it were, a stark, fixed gaze. A little later, Hussein, having first made quite an unintelligible grimace, and then with a voice expressing pained tenderness, turned to Beelzebub, who was still continuing to think. "Grandfather, dear grandfather, manifest please allow those informations which you have in your common presences, particularly dear to me, and which you have learned during your long existence, and which may serve me as material for the elucidation of that question which has just arisen in my essence, and even for the approximate representation of which I have as yet positively no data for a logical confrontation in any of the spiritualized parts of my common presence. This question arising in my essence, the answer to which has already become necessary to the whole of my presence, consists in this: to inquire about the reasons why, namely, if these unfortunate free-brain beings who breed on the planet Earth do not have the possibility, owing to reasons not depending on themselves, of acquiring and having in the period of their responsible existence divine objective reason. Why, since they arose so long ago and their species has continued to exist such a long time, could not those customs have been gradually formed by now, only thanks to the flow of time, in the process of their ordinary existence, even under these abnormal conditions, and these proper instinctive automatic habits have been acquired in their presences of every being in general, thanks to which their ordinary existence, both egoistically personal as well as collectively general, might flow more or less tolerably in the sense of objective reality. Having said this, our poor Hussein began questionably to gaze at the cause of his arising. At the question of his favourite grandson, Beelzebub began to relate the following. Why, of course, my dear boy. In the course of long centuries of their existence, and among them as everywhere on planets where beings arise who spend likewise part of the time of their existence simply in the ordinary process, many customs and also what are called moral habits, at times very good and useful for their ordinary existence, were also gradually formed, and even at the present time are sometimes formed among several of their groupings. But herein lies the evil, that such a being welfare as becomes fixed in the process of ordinary existence from the flow of time alone, and which approves, thanks to transmission from generation to generation, also soon either entirely disappears, or is changed to such a direction that these happy achievements of theirs are transformed of their own accord into unhappy ones, and increase the number of those small factors maleficent for them, the totality of which year by year dilutes more and more both their psyche as well as their very essence. If they were even to possess and were to use at least those trifles worthy of the free-brain beings, then this would already be to the good for them, or, as they themselves would say, would in any case be better than nothing. Of course, if at least any of these good customs, fixed by them in the process of their existence, and already automatized moral habits, could have survived and been transformed by inheritance into the mode of existence of their subsequent generations, then thanks at least to this, their, in the objective sense, desolate existence would have seemed to be, to an outside, impartial observer, at least a little reconcilable. The causes of the complete destruction and change of even this being welfare for their tolerable existence achieved by time, both of good customs as well as moral usages, are of course only engendered by those abnormal conditions for the ordinary being existence around them established by them themselves. As a concentrated result flowing from these abnormal conditions around them, and which became the basic cause for this evil of theirs, there is a special property which arose not long ago in their psyche, which they themselves call suggestibility. Thanks to this strange property, which had only recently become fixed in their psyche, all the functionings in their common presences began gradually to change, and as a result each of them, particularly the beings who arose and became responsible during the last centuries of theirs, already began to represent in themselves such a peculiar cosmic formation as has in itself the possibility of acting exclusively only if it were to find itself constantly under the influence of another formation similar to itself. And indeed, my boy, at the present time, these free-brain beings who please you must already, as separate persons, as well as entire large and small groupings, infallibly influence or find themselves under the influence of others. For your better representation and all-round understanding in what way customs and automatic habits useful for their ordinary existence acquired by them during centuries also disappear without a trace, or change for the worse on account of the mentioned property of their strange psyche, we will take as an example just these same terrestrial free-brain beings with their customs, whom all other beings of your planet call Russians, and who represent the majority of that community named Russia. In consequence of the fact that the existence of beings which have been put as a basis of the formation of this large contemporary community there, and of their subsequent generations, proceeded in the course of many centuries in the neighbourhood of beings who belonged to those Asiatic communities, who, thanks to various events, existed so relatively long a period, in consequence of which, in the process of their ordinary existence, as this in general happens from a long existence, very many good customs and moral habits were gradually formed by themselves and became fixed in the process of their ordinary existence. Then these Russians, after meeting with the beings of these terrestrial beings' ancient communities, and even at times having friendly mutual relationships with them, gradually adopted and began to use in the process of their ordinary existence many of the useful customs and moral habits. And so, my boy, thanks to the mentioned strange property of the free brain being of this planet of yours, which property, as I have already told you, arose and gradually became, soon after the Tiglath-Pileser civilization, fixed in their general psyche, the intensity of the fixing proceeded chiefly in consequence of all the more deteriorating conditions around them of ordinary being existence established by themselves, and which special psychic property already from the very beginning became obligatorily inherent in the common presences of beings composing this later largest community there. On account of all this, they in all former centuries found themselves under the influence of beings of one or other of the Asiatic communities, and all the, as it is called, external mode and psychic associative form of their ordinary existence proceeded also under their influence. And so, again, in consequence of the fact that in the common presences of the free brain beings of this planet Earth of yours, who dwell on that part of the continent Asia, which was called, and until now is called, Russia, being part Gurdjieff, also finally ceased to be actualized, on account of which this, for them, most maleficent property of their psyche, namely suggestibility, began gradually to increase, and in consequence of the fact that they, thanks to changed circumstances which flowed from always the same terrifying process of periodic reciprocal destruction, existing only on that ill-starred planet, were deprived of the former influence and were compelled, not having the possibility of independent existence, to fall under new influences. They this time fell under the influence of beings of the European communities, chiefly of the community which exists there under the name France. Since the beings of this community France began automatically to influence the psyche of the beings of the community Russia, and these latter began even to strive to imitate the beings of this community France in everything, thus all the good customs among them, which were already present in the process of their existence, and those moral habits which had become inherent in them, either half-consciously or automatically taken by them from the beings of the ancient Asiatic communities, were gradually forgotten and new ones, French, acquired. Among the customs and automatic moral habits useful for the beings of the community Russia, transmitted to them from the beings of old Asiatic communities, there were thousands of indeed very good ones. From these thousands of good customs and useful habits, let us take, for example, at least two. The custom, after using the first being food, of chewing what is called keva, and the usage of periodically washing oneself in what are called hammams. Keva is a certain mastic prepared from various roots, which is chewed after eating, and which, however long it is chewed, hardly ever decomposes, but on the contrary becomes still more elastic. This mastic was also invented by a certain being with good reason, who belonged to one of the old Asiatic communities. The use of chewing this keva consists in this, that by chewing it, much is what is called there on earth saliva, and also other substances are formed in beings, which are worked out by their planetary bodies, so that their first being food may be the better and more easily transformed in them, or as they themselves say, so that this food may be the better and more easily digested and assimilated. Thanks to this keva, their teeth are also strengthened, and the cavities in their mouths too are cleaned from the remains of the first food. The use of keva is very necessary for your favourites, particularly for this second purpose, as these remains, not decomposing owing to the chewing of keva, do not give off that disagreeable odour from their mouths, which has already become proper particularly to the contemporary free-brain beings there. And the second custom, namely the washing at times in special rooms of theirs called the hammam, was also invented by a certain ancient Asiatic being. In order clearly to understand the necessity for this second custom in the process of the existence of terrestrial beings, the following must be first explained to you. The functioning of the planetary body of beings of all forms of external coatings is adapted by nature in general in such a way that the process of their nourishment with the second being food, which your favourites call breathing of air, proceeds in them, and this nourishment is taken in not only through the organs of breathing, but also through what are called the pores present in their skin. Through the pores of the skin of the beings, not only the new second being food enters, but also through several of these pores, after the transformation of this second being food, those parts of this food are given off from the skin which are either no longer necessary for the planetary body of the beings, or which are already the result of its transmutation. These unnecessary parts should be given off from the said pores of the skin of beings by evaporating gradually by themselves, thanks to those factors which obtain from the process proceeding in that sphere itself where the given beings exist, as for instance, from the movement of the atmosphere, from accidental contacts, and so on. Now, when your favourites invented the covering of themselves with what are called clothes, then, since these clothes of theirs began to hinder the normal elimination or evaporation of those parts of the second being food unnecessary for the planetary body, these unnecessary substances having no possibility of evaporating into space, and at the same time always continuing to accumulate, they, condensing, begin to form in these various pores of their skin the accumulation of a certain oily something. From that time on, among a number of other factors, this also began to aid in the formation on this ill-fated planet of innumerable and various illnesses, which, taken altogether, are the chief cause of the gradual shortening of the length of the existence of these unfortunates. Well, my boy, when still in, as your contemporary favourites say, the dim ancient past, a wise and learned being, by name Amambakolot, also from the continent Asia there, once clearly constated during his conscious observations of various facts proceeding around him, that this oily something which collects in the pores of the skin has also a maleficent influence on the general functioning of the whole planetary body. He began to elucidate and seek for means for wiping out at least this evil. As a result of the investigations and long deliberations of this Amambakolot, and of several other also learned beings who then became his followers and began to help him, they arrived at the conclusion and became convinced of the impossibility of obtaining that beings similar to themselves should not wear clothes, and that it was necessary to seek a method for artificially eliminating from the pores of the skin these remains of the second food by means of implanting in the psyche of the beings around them some or other being usage, which in the course of time would become indispensably necessary to them, and in this way enter into their habits and customs. And that these Asiatic learned beings, with this great Amambaka at their head, then experimentally elucidated and naturalized this in practice. Well, this served as a beginning of those hammams which exist there in places even till now. At that time, they, during the learned experiments, elucidated, among other things, that by ordinary washing, even with hot water, it was impossible to obtain the elimination of these deposits from the pores of the skin, as these excretions of the planetary body are found not on the surface of the skin, but in the depths of the pores. Their further elucidatory experiments showed them that the cleansing of the pores of the skin from these deposits was possible only by means of slow warming, thanks to which this deposited oily something acquires the possibility of gradually dissolving and of being eliminated from the pores of the skins of beings. Well, for this purpose they then invented and actualized in practice special rooms which later came to be called hammams, the sense and significance of which they knew how to spread among the beings of the whole continent in such a way that in the psyche of all the Asiatic beings the need was implanted in the process of their existence for the use of these rooms for the given procedure. Well, it is this need of going periodically to such hammocks which had already become inherent in the beings of the continent Asia, and which later passed also to the beings of this community Russia. As regards this oily something which collects in certain pores of the skins of your favourites, it is necessary further to tell you the following. As this substance, i.e. the oily something, like everything in general that exists in our great universe, cannot remain in one and the same state. Therefore, there inevitably proceed with these substances in these pores the processes of what are called evolution and involution required by great nature. And in consequence of the fact that during these processes, from all cosmic what are called temporary or transitory arisings, there are given off what are called secondary active elements, that is, those which are temporarily crystallized by the momentum of vibration, and which, as is known to all, have the property, when adjacent to the organ of smell of beings, of being perceived very cacophonically. Therefore, there on the planet Earth, there is always given off from your favourites who do not use the said hammams, a particular grashruponili, or as they themselves say, odour, which even they consider not altogether pleasant. And indeed, my boy, there on certain continents, particularly on the continent of Europe, where the custom of going to the hammam does not obtain, it was very difficult for me as a being with a very acute sense of smell to exist among those free-brained beings on account of this specific grashruponilo, or as they sometimes call it, odour, which issues from them. This unpleasant odour which issues from those, the pores of whose skin are never specially cleaned, was so strong that I could without any difficulty detect which community the given being belonged, and even by those odours I could distinguish one being from another. Now this variety of these specific odours depends upon how long the decomposition of these oily excretions found in the pores of the skin has proceeded. These unpleasant odours, fortunately for them, do not affect them so tormentingly, and they do not affect them because their sense of smell is very slightly developed, and besides this, existing always among these odours, they gradually become accustomed to them. And so, my boy, just this custom, namely of washing themselves periodically in special hammams, was taken by the Russians from the Asiatic beings. But when they fell under the influence of the European beings, and for the most part, as I have already told you, of the beings of the community France, then in view of the fact that these French beings have not the custom of going to the hammam, they also gradually ceased to use hammams, and thus this good custom established for centuries among them began little by little to disappear. Formerly, almost every Russian family had its own hammam, but recently, when I was in their chief place of existence, the former St. Petersburg, for the last time, and where at that time more than 2 millions of these Russian beings existed, there were only 7 or 8 of such hammams there, and even then only those beings went to those hammams who were called there house porters and workmen, that is, beings who happened to come there to the capital from distant villages, where the custom of going to the hammam, or as they sometimes call it, the bath, had not yet been quite wiped out. Now, as regards the main population of this capital, who consisted chiefly of the beings of what are called the ruling class, these beings, in recent times, did not go to the hammam at all, and if any queer fellow was still sometimes from old habit to go, he would then try in every way that no one else in his caste should know about it. May crooked luck save him, otherwise such gossip would fly around about this bold fellow as would inevitably ruin the whole of his future career. To go to the hammam is now considered among beings belonging to the ruling class as very indecent and unintelligent, but indecent and unintelligent only because the contemporary most intelligent beings of their planet, who, according to their understanding of the French, do not go to the hammam. These unfortunates do not know, of course, that these same French, thanks always to the same reasons, namely thanks to the abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence, still but a few decades ago, not only did not go to the hammam, but these French, particularly as they are called the intelligentsia, did not even wash themselves in the morning in order not to spoil their, at that time, fashionable artificial appearance, which was difficult to rearrange. Now, as regards the second of the good customs taken as an example by us, the fulfilling of which 2 centuries ago was still organically needed by every being of this community, Russia, namely the custom of chewing kebar after the use of the first being food, this custom already no longer exists there at all now among contemporary Russians. It must be remarked that at the present time, the custom of chewing kebar without meanwhile understanding its purport began to implant itself while I was still there among the beings dwelling on the continent called America, where the use of such kebar, or as they have already called it by another name, chewing gum, is very widely spread, and even takes on the dimensions of a great manufacturing branch of commerce there. Meanwhile, it is interesting to notice that the fundamental part of this American chewing gum is exported just from Russia, namely from the locality called Caucasia. The beings dwelling in this locality do not even know why these mad Americans import this unnecessary root good for nothing and for nobody. Of course, to no one of them does the thought even enter his head that these Americans importing this good-for-nothing root are indeed, though in a subjective sense, mad, yet in an objective sense they are merely, as they themselves express it, daylight robbers of the beings of this Russia. Well, my boy, in the same way a mass of other good customs, as well as moral habits, adopted in the course of centuries by these Russian beings, and already well fixed in the process of their ordinary existence during the last 2 centuries, when these Russians became the objects of influence of the European beings, began gradually to disappear, and instead of them new customs and new moral habits were formed among them, which they have at the present time, such as the usage of kissing a lady's hand, being polite only with young ladies, looking at a wife before her husband with the left eye, and so on and so forth. It is necessary to emphasize with an impulse of regret that at the present time the same continues to proceed in all the processes of the ordinary existence of the beings of all communities there, on whatever continent it may be. I hope, my boy, that by now you may approximately picture to yourself and be satisfied about the question arising in your being, why, namely, in spite of the fact that there are among these unfortunate favourites of yours, their species has arisen and existed so long a time, could not those automatic being usages and instinctive habits have by now been formed, by which their existence, although even with the absence of objective consciousness, might flow more or less tolerably? I repeat, thanks to the said property which only recently became fixed in their general psyche, it has already become natural at the present time, and as it were according to law, always either to influence another or to find oneself under the influence of others. In both cases, the results of the action of this peculiar property are obtained without any consciousness on their part, and even without their desire. From all that I have told you about this, that these contemporary Russians always follow the example of someone and imitate somebody, it can be clearly understood how much of the functioning of the data for being confrontative logical mentation is already deteriorated in the presences of terrestrial free-brain beings. In general, to follow the example of others or set an example to others is considered and cognized as fully reasonable and, inevitably, necessary everywhere in the universe among all free-brain beings, and that the free-brain beings of this large community Russia follow the example of the beings of the community France. This, on their part, is even very sensible. Why not take example from what is good? But these unfortunates, on account of the said particular property of their psyche, and of still several other specific features of their strange character which have finally become fixed in them, thanks to the total disappearance from their common presences of the usage of sometimes actualizing being part dog duty, become what is called adopters by compulsion, and began to follow the example also of what is bad, and even to reject their own good customs only because they do not exist elsewhere. They could not, for instance, consider even this, that conditions of ordinary existence among these French beings are perhaps being built up all the time abnormally, and therefore they had not yet had time to become aware of the necessity of sometimes, as in the given case, washing themselves in hammams and chewing keva after using the first being food. But to throw away good customs directly acquired for the sole reason that they do not exist among the beings of this France from whom they take example, this is already indeed genuine Turkiness. Although this strange peculiarity which I have just called Turkiness has already become inherent in almost all the free-brain beings who breed on this planet of yours, yet the manifestation and the results of it are noticed to a great extent among the free-brain beings who breed on the continent of Europe. This I constated and understood later when I departed from St. Petersburg to travel in various countries of this continent of Europe, on which this time I remained for a long while, and not for a short time as has happened on my former travels, and I had therefore time for observation and investigation for the final details of the psyche, not only of separate beings, but also of many together in all kinds of surrounding conditions. The form of external existence of all communities existing on this continent of Europe is little distinguished from the external form of existence on the beings of that large community Russia. The form, however, of existence of the beings of the various groupings of this continent differs among themselves only insomuch as, thanks to the accidental longer or shorter continuity of the existence of the given community, there had been time for certain good customs and instinctive habits to be automatically acquired, and which became proper to the beings only of just this said community. Here, by the way, It is necessary to remark that the duration there of the existence of any community plays indeed a great role in the sense of the acquisition by beings of its good customs and instinctive habits. But unfortunately for all the free-brain beings of the whole universe of every degree of reason, the existence of every grouping of theirs, already more or less organized, is in general short-lived, thanks of course to that ever-same chief particularity of theirs, namely, periodic reciprocal destruction. As soon as good being usages for automatic existence begin to be established in the general process of any of their groupings, this terrifying process suddenly begins to proceed, and thus either these good customs and automatic habits acquired during centuries are totally destroyed, or the beings of the given grouping, thanks already to the mentioned property, fall under the influence of beings of another grouping who have nothing in common with those under whose influence they were before this, and therefore very soon all these customs and moral habits acquired during centuries are replaced by other new ones, which in most cases are premature and in which most cases are good for only, as is said, a day.